travel today?
Love that music.
Yes. Yeah. Amazing. Well, today is the anniversary of a major event that's captured the minds and hearts of many, the sinking of the Titanic.
Yeah, joining us now is meteorologist Christian Bridges, who's going to tell us what the weather was like that night and how it played a role in the ship sinking.
I know. Okay, so I'm really excited for this. I have been a Titanic nerd forever. I'm sure you guys have seen the movie.
Yep.
It's such an iconic story, and it changed a lot of things, not only for ship safety, but also in forecasting and alerting all the ships in the Atlantic about icebergs and that sort of thing. So yeah, kind of cool. It's been 113 years.
Wow.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah.
So on this night, 113 years ago, is when the Titanic hit the iceberg, and then it sank. It hit the iceberg at 11:30 or so p.m. and sank 2 a.m. the next day on the 15th. So yeah, kind of crazy.
Yeah, chilling.
Chilling.
Honestly.
I know.
Yeah.
And last week was actually cold water safety week in Maine.
Oh.
And it's just so interesting to think, being in that frigid water, what those people went through. So really fascinating. So let's talk about some of the weather factors that went into the sinking, because there was a lot of things, a ton had to go wrong for this to happen, and weather definitely played a role. So you can see here's the Titanic back in right before it was about to go on its maiden voyage, that of course ended in disaster. But of course, before we talk about the Titanic's journey, we got to talk about the iceberg and how it came to be in the Titanic's path. Well, the icebergs, they almost all come from Greenland. They break off of the coast of Greenland, off of the ice sheet there, and then they tend to drift to the south and they get picked up by the Labrador Current. And this is a very cold water current. Of course, it's coming from the north, going to the south. So the icebergs don't melt very quickly as they're brought to the south. So that's what allows them to make it that long journey from Greenland all the way past Canada and out into the open ocean. Now, the Titanic was leaving Ireland. That's where it was. It had 3 stops. So it started in the UK, it went to France, and then it went to Ireland. And then after that was when it went across the ocean towards the US. So here's its path. You can see it went from Ireland and down to the south. And they knew that there was a lot of icebergs. They already knew that. They actually deviated the Titanic's path off to the south a little bit, but it was not enough to avoid the iceberg. So that's what's called Iceberg Alley there, that area near Newfoundland down into the open Atlantic. That's where the icebergs come, and then they just kind of melt away usually, but of course still plenty big enough by the time they get into the ocean to sink a ship. So there's the sinking location. You can see it was actually, I always think this is so interesting, it really was not that far away from land.
I was just noticing that.
Only just a few hundred miles, so they weren't that far from ending their journey. It was right at the very end that they actually ended up hitting the iceberg. So now we know all the backstory, how the iceberg got there, how the Titanic intersected with the iceberg. Let's talk about the weather on that night. On paper, you would think that the weather would be great for driving a ship in. It was completely calm. In fact, all of the survivor accounts, they all mentioned the ocean was just so calm that night.
Yeah.
It was flat like a lake. There was no waves whatsoever. There had been a cold front that had moved through the day before that had really cleared out behind it. High pressure was in place. So it was super calm and also very cold as well. So not only was the water cold, the air was also very cold. You can see the sinking location there right under that high pressure. So it was super calm. Now, why is this bad for the Titanic? Well, those super calm conditions, they made there was no waves, of course. So those waves, they break against the iceberg. And when we have a typical ocean, with some chop in the ocean, you can see that foam that's created by the waves hitting the iceberg. So it makes them easier to see. There's like a ring of white around them. Also, that night there was a new moon. So there was no moonlight. It was pitch dark, only the stars, and there was no waves. So the iceberg was just super hard to see. And then I mentioned that cold Labrador Current. As the Titanic entered that current and it went into Iceberg Alley, there was a temperature inversion in place. The water was so cold, the air was a little bit warmer, so it made somewhat of a haze, and it made the iceberg invisible until the last minute. It was too late for them to turn away, and they ended up hitting the iceberg. Now, of course, there's a lot of other factors. They were going really fast into Iceberg Alley. They had a ton of warnings, and they kind of disregarded them. There's a lot of factors that go into why the Titanic sank, but this is a big part of it. You can imagine if they had seen the iceberg earlier, they could have turned away. They almost made it. They only scraped along the side, and that's what caused the ship to sink. So, yeah, it's kind of interesting to imagine, how history would have been so different if like one of those little factors was different. Maybe there was bigger waves that night, or maybe there was the moon shining. Kind of interesting to think how it could have ended up.
Yeah, it's a little
especially
heartbreaking.
The
Yeah.
moon
Yeah.
portion of it, like just every little aspect, like everything contributed to this. And
Yes.
it's so fascinating to really do a deep dive on how this happened.
Exactly. And you know, they didn't have binoculars up in the lookout nest, like so many little things. It's amazing. You read this a lot during big disasters. It's never just one thing usually that caused it. It's a bunch of little things that added up, and all of a sudden, you know, it came together in a really terrible way.
Wow. Well, it's
I know.
fascinating also I had never heard of Iceberg Alley.
Yeah,
Is that what
Yeah.
I had not heard of that.
First time
So
hearing that.
It's interesting, and to see how they mostly come from Greenland too.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting, you know, hearing about how many warnings they got and how they kind of disregarded all of them because, you know, they thought we're the biggest, best ship in the
Unsinkable.
world.
Yep.
We're unsinkable.
Ugh.
And we all know how that turned out.
I know.
I have the chills right now.
I
I know,
know.
right? Isn't that crazy?
Well, if it means that, you know, we can enhance our safety,
Yeah.
at least we can, you know, learn.
Exactly.
From it.
And
Yeah.
nothing like that has happened since
Right.
with an iceberg. So it goes to show that we definitely learned our lesson with that. Well, if you've got any weather related or weather history related questions you'd like to ask our Weather Authority team, you can email us at weather@wgme.com.